All right, so you're probably bombarded right now with all these headlines and this ticking clock for TikTok here in the US. And it's like, we're talking just days left.
Yeah.
Saturday, April 5th, 2025 to be exact. And, it's really hitting home that this hugely popular app that everybody's using might actually get banned.
It is amazing to see it unfolding this quickly.
Yeah.
And, I mean, the players that are stepping up to try to grab a piece of this, I don't think anybody saw this coming a few years back.
It's really remarkable. Yeah. So in this deep dive, we are going to focus on that deadline that's coming up that's forcing TikTok to either find a U.S. owner or basically disappear from all of our app stores. And we're going to figure out why this is all happening now because, the list of companies and people who've expressed interest in buying it.
It's a wild list.
It is a wild list. It's really surprising.
To try to understand this whole thing and,
Yeah.
What's signal and what's noise, we've gone deep into some really key reporting here. We've got articles from CNN, from Reuters, the national news desk, and then a bunch of briefing documents that are trying to pull this whole thing together.
Exactly. So we want to make sure that we answer those key questions. What is driving this urgency? Who are all these potential buyers and what are they after? What kind of deals are on the table? And what are the biggest things standing in the way of TikTok still being around next week? So consider this your crash course on a really dynamic and significant situation.
Yeah.
So let's start with that really basic question. Why the pressure? Why is this even a possibility?
Well, you hit the nail on the head with that date, Saturday, April 5th, 2025. That is the current deadline for ByteDance to sell its U.S. operations. But that's not the first deadline this has gone through.
Right, because we had an earlier deadline that was pushed back. So what was the thinking behind that?
That extension came from President Trump right when he came into office in his first few days, and his goal there was to give his administration time to figure out a plan. Basically, he wanted to balance national security concerns with the disruption of just shutting down an app that so many millions of Americans use.
Right, it wasn't just a bureaucratic delay. There was a thought process there.
Right, they wanted to get a deal done.
But let's get to the real reason. Why is this whole threat of divestiture or a ban even on the table?
It all comes down to national security, and there's actually bipartisan agreement on this, which is rare in Washington. The U.S. government from both sides of the aisle has concerns about TikTok's ties to its parent company ByteDance, which is Chinese, and they've labeled ByteDance a foreign adversary.
And what exactly are they worried about?
The main worry is that user data could be misused. In other words, that the Chinese government could force ByteDance to hand over information on American TikTok users. And on top of that, there's a fear of influence that the platform's reach could be used to spread propaganda or influence stuff going on here in the U.S. to favor China's interests.
Now, we have to remember TikTok and ByteDance have always denied these claims. They say they operate independently and they would never give user data to the Chinese government.
They have been adamant about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But the law that was passed last year basically gives ByteDance an ultimatum: sell TikTok to a U.S. company that meets certain requirements or get banned in the United States.
And it can't just be any sale, right? There's some pretty specific conditions.
You got the law calls for a qualified divestiture. So that means ByteDance's ownership in the U.S. version of TikTok would be limited to 20% at most. And here's the big one. There can't be any coordination between ByteDance and this new U.S. TikTok company on things like the algorithm, which, as we know, is like TikTok's magic formula for those addictive video feeds.
Right.
Or on how they handle data. The separation has to be complete and provable.
So basically, if TikTok wants to stay in the U.S. without a ban after this weekend, a deal has to be pretty far along and clearly on track to meet these tough conditions. That's what would trigger another extension, right?
Absolutely. If there's no real sign of progress toward a deal that meets the requirements, then that April 5th deadline is serious business.
Okay, so we've got the clock ticking and the stakes are high. Let's talk about who actually wants to buy TikTok. And it seems like we've got some interesting names in the mix now, including Amazon.
Yeah, that was definitely unexpected.
Yeah.
Amazon sent a letter to Vice President Vance and Secretary Lutnick saying they want to make a bid.
But I've heard that some of the main people who've been involved in these talks for a while aren't taking Amazon's bid very seriously. What's the reason for that?
A few things are contributing to that feeling. One is the timing. It's really late in the game, almost like they're trying to squeeze in right before the deadline.
The 11th hour.
Exactly. And it seems that Vice President Vance and his team have already been working on some much more complex deals with other investors for a while now. So this kind of simple bid from Amazon might not fit with those plans.
That makes sense if you're already juggling these complicated deals with multiple parties. Amazon coming in solo at the last minute could throw a wrench in things.
It could.
But Amazon has been hinting that they want a bigger piece of the social media world for some time now, haven't they?
You're right. They've definitely shown they have long-term ambitions for social media. I mean, they bought Twitch, the live streaming platform, and Goodreads, the book review site, years ago. And they even tried their own short-form video feature called Inspire, which was a little like TikTok, but they ended up shutting it down earlier this year. So their interest in TikTok, even if it's a late play, does make sense in their bigger strategy.
And it sounds like the news that Amazon might be interested had an immediate effect, at least on Wall Street.
Oh yeah, their stock went up about 2% after the news broke. So even if the people involved in the negotiations aren't sure about Amazon's bid, the market seems to think there's value in it.
So we've got Amazon as a bit of a surprise entry, but that's not the only unexpected name we've heard about. There were rumors of a bid from the founder of OnlyFans, which raised a few eyebrows.
For sure. Tim Stokely, the guy who started OnlyFans, is apparently running a startup called Zoop, and they've teamed up with a cryptocurrency foundation to put together a bid for TikTok. It's definitely an interesting addition to the list.
So those are the newcomers, but who are the big names, the ones that have been in the conversation for a while and are seen as the more serious contenders?
This is where things get really complex. It seems like the most likely path forward involves these more elaborate deals, not just one company buying the whole thing. Oracle, for instance, has been consistently interested, and you might remember their Project Texas idea from a couple of years back, where they wanted to store all U.S. user data separately on Oracle servers to address those security worries.
Right. Project Texas came up during President Trump's previous term as a way to maybe avoid a ban back then, but it didn't really solve the problem. So Oracle is still in the game. What about Blackstone, the big investment firm?
Blackstone is reportedly looking at joining forces with ByteDance's non-Chinese shareholders. That's groups like Susquehanna International Group and General Atlantic. The idea is for Blackstone to contribute money as part of a bid specifically for TikTok's U.S. operations.
So it's not so much about one company taking over, but more about a group of investors coming together to carve out the U.S. business?
Exactly. And then we've got Andreessen Horowitz, a major venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, whose founder, Mark Andreessen, actually knows Elon Musk, and Silver Lake, another big private equity firm. Both of them have reportedly shown interest in being part of the deal, too.
And we can't forget about Microsoft. They tried to buy TikTok a few years ago. Are they still in the mix?
Yes, their name has come up again. Sources say they recently offered something like $40 billion for the app. You might remember they made a bid for $30 billion back in 2020 with Walmart, but it didn't work out. Now, at least one person from the administration has said that Microsoft hasn't officially submitted a bid this time, so it's not totally clear how involved they are right now.
It sounds like Vice President J.D. Vance is really the point person for the White House on this.
He is. He's leading the charge to find a buyer, or I should say a group of investors, that can meet those strict requirements in the law. And he's expected to present President Trump with a plan probably involving several of these big firms with the goal of significantly reducing ByteDance's control.
And from what we're hearing, the White House isn't even considering a straight-up sale to one company anymore.
That seems to be the direction they're moving, and the idea that to go with this more complicated model. One source said they've been working on this very complex new ownership group that includes complex technological agreements dictated by law in this new structure.
So it's not just who owns it, but also setting up clear technical and operational independence from ByteDance.
Right.
So with all these potential players and complex deals, there have to be some major roadblocks to actually getting a deal done.
Oh, absolutely. There are some big hurdles. One of the most obvious is getting President Trump to agree. In the end, he has to sign off on any deal, and as we've said, his views on TikTok have evolved a bit. He started by wanting to ban it, but lately he's talked about how it could be useful for reaching young voters. So what he decides to do is going to be crucial.
And it's not just the president here in the U.S. who needs to be on board, right? There's another major player in all of this.
That's right. President Xi Jinping of China also has to agree to any sale of TikTok's assets. And reports suggest he's not keen on giving up what China sees as valuable technology, especially TikTok's algorithm. That system that recommends content is seen as a key piece of technology that China doesn't want to let go of.
Yeah, that algorithm is a huge part of TikTok's success. It's what keeps people hooked and scrolling. So any deal where ByteDance has to give up control of that is going to face pushback from Beijing.
Exactly. And that creates real tension between the U.S. wanting to protect national security and China's desire to hold on to its technological edge. Another big challenge is balancing the government's security concerns with how popular TikTok is. I mean, we're talking an app that almost half of all Americans use, so any move to ban it or change it significantly is going to affect a lot of people.
So it's a tough situation trying to keep the country safe while also respecting the choices of so many users. And we've already seen the deadline for this decision move a few times. We started with January 19th. Then President Trump added 75 days when he came into office, and now it's April 5th. It's interesting that TikTok actually thanked President Trump for that delay. Shows you how complicated this whole thing is.
Yeah, it highlights how fluid and political this process is. And just to keep you updated, there's a big meeting happening today, Wednesday, April 2nd, where Vice President Vance Secretary Lutnick, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard are all supposed to present these different deal options to President Trump, so things could move pretty quickly.
So where do we stand right now? We have this deadline that's almost here. A bunch of potential buyers from big tech companies like Amazon and Oracle to some surprises like the OnlyFans founder. And it seems like the most likely scenario is a group of investors taking over rather than one company buying the whole thing. And on top of all that, you have to get both the U.S. and Chinese governments to agree, which is no easy task.
Yeah. And let's not forget the main reason behind all of this. The U.S. government is really worried about a Chinese company owning such a widely used platform.
Right. So with all these moving pieces and challenges, it makes you wonder, what will TikTok even look like in the U.S. after April 5th? Will it be totally different with new owners, or will it basically be the same, just with a new investment structure?
Yeah, it really raises some big questions about the future of online platforms in a world that's becoming more interconnected but also more politically divided. How do countries balance security with free access to information and the huge popularity of these apps that people all over the world use?
It's a story we'll definitely be following closely for our listeners. This is far from over. The next few days leading up to that April 5th deadline are going to be really important. This could have big consequences for technology, international relations, and how we all get our news and entertainment. But this deep dive should give you the background you need to understand what happens next in this whole saga.
For sure.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned.